An American president and a North Korean leader have never even talked on the phone, let alone met each other face to face. It's a historic development.
It's a bold move, it's a big move, it's an unexpected move. Kim Jong-un is following a very serious game plan.
The next few weeks are going to be cram time in Washington, getting ready for that conversation.
It's the first time the world watched Kim Jong-un meeting with high-level delegation. How was his performance?
He was very much playing to the cameras.
He wants to project a decidedly modern image to the world.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. President Trump accepted invitation to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. President Trump said he would meet Kim Jong-un by May. North Korea says it is committed to denuclearization and will refrain from any further nuclear and missile tests.
President Trump appreciated the briefing and said he would meet Kim Jong-un by May. Kim pledged that North Korea will refrain from any further nuclear or missile tests.
Now my guest today, Mr. Abraham Denmark, Director of the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Mr. Denmark served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. Also joining me, Mr. Frank Januzzi, President of the Mansfield Foundation and a former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Frank, let me begin with you. We're sitting here anticipating a possible meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. How was this possible? Is it the deal-maker style of the two leaders that made it possible?
Well, you know, Yoon-jong, President Obama wrote a book called The Audacity of Hope. But I think President Trump has appropriated that first word, audacity, by accepting this invitation from Kim Jong-un to a summit meeting. It's a bold move, it's a big move, it's an unexpected move. It apparently is a decision that caught most of his senior advisors by surprise as well. Secretary Tillerson is in Djibouti, Africa, and I think was blindsided by this announcement. I think what makes it possible is the shrewd and determined diplomatic efforts by President Moon Jae-in of South Korea. He's been working really hard to bring the North Koreans to the table. And then I think the ego of President Trump, who understands that sometimes if you want to reach out to a country like North Korea, you should do it at the top. And Trump imagines himself a great deal maker, and so he decided, what the heck, I might as well roll the dice and go big.
Abe, how significant is this decision? Just less than a year ago, the two leaders were on a war of words, and President Trump mentioned fire and fury on North Korea. But coming this far, how significant is this?
It's very significant. It's a historic development. An American president and a North Korean leader have never even talked on the phone, let alone met each other face to face. And it's a remarkable accomplishment, really, for the two to even have an idea that they'll be meeting with one another. It's also a big gamble. The idea that an American president would convey that degree of legitimacy and prestige to a North Korean leader, really without any idea of what we're getting in return, is a big gamble. And there's a lot of questions about how we get to the table, if there's going to be any preconditions for the talks to actually take place, and then what happens when the two leaders actually sit down with each other.
Abe mentioned that it's a big gamble. Frank, can the two leaders, do you think they can maybe make a big deal, hitting all the core points when they sit down together?
Well, the thing about summit meetings is that they are rarely a place at which actual negotiations take place. The negotiations, the hard work is usually supposed to precede a summit meeting. But in this case, with the end of May only a couple of months out, I think what you're more likely to see is a very dramatic, significant meeting between the two leaders. But I think a lot of the hard work to actually accomplish any progress toward denuclearization and peace may have to happen after the summit. So keeping expectations in check is going to be very important. But I also think that the Trump administration really needs a game plan, because I think Kim Jong-un is following a very serious game plan that he laid out in his New Year's address in January of this year. I think he has a pretty good idea of what he expects to get out of a summit meeting, as well as what concessions he hopes to extract from the United States in return for steps toward denuclearization. I'm not sure that the Trump administration has all of those ducks in a row yet. I think they're still planning. It's going to take a lot of work for them to prepare.
Abe, do you also agree with Frank that there is going to be a meeting between the leaders first, and then there's going to be follow-up discussions, or will there be more in-depth preparatory talks first and then the summit? How do you see it?
I think the next few weeks are going to be cram time, especially for people in Washington, getting ready for that conversation, working with the North Koreans to figure out the specifics, where it's going to be, when it will take place, if North Korea needs to make any statements beforehand, if the United States needs to make any statements beforehand. There's a lot of uncertainty there. I think Frank is exactly right. These summit meetings are not traditionally the place of where negotiations take place. But the old playbook is out the window. This is unprecedented, and it's unclear how this may work. But there's also still a lot that we don't know. The President Trump has said repeatedly that the United States is not going to accept North Korea as a nuclear power, would not tolerate North Korean capabilities to strike the United States with nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-un has only said, as we understand through the South Koreans, that they're willing to talk about denuclearization and that they would only not need nuclear weapons if the threat were removed. So there's a lot that we don't know. It's very unclear to me that there's actually a landing place for the two sides, and it's unclear what happens when the two leaders actually sit down with each other.
Right.
I think Abe makes a great point. And you know, President Moon Jae-in, when he was considering an invitation from Kim Jong-un for a summit meeting, he said, well, let me sleep on it. And then he got back to Kim Jong-un with requirements about the venue, which he ultimately decided would be Panmunjom. And he also got back to Kim Jong-un with certain requirements about what would take place at the summit meeting, as well as the hope that North Korea would engage with the U.S. What's interesting here is that Donald Trump apparently has accepted the invitation in principle without making similar kinds of requirements or new ones on the North. So now a lot of hard work is going to have to be done even just to figure out where they're going to meet. And Abe and I were talking about this a little bit this morning. You know, maybe a neutral spot would be best. Maybe Beijing or someplace not Pyongyang, not Seoul, not Washington, but maybe a neutral location. But we'll see.
North Korea says it wants a security guarantee for denuclearization. This sounds like an old position that we've repeatedly heard like for more than 2 decades. How can this time, can it be different? Like, what are the key points that we need to clarify before going into this talk with North Korean leader and the U.S. leader? Abe.
Yeah, we've offered security guarantees in the past. In 2005, in the joint statement that came out of the six-party talks, the United States did offer security guarantees to North Korea. And in the same statement, North Korea committed to denuclearization, to ending its nuclear program. And roughly a year after that statement, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test. And what the North Koreans have said subsequently is they point to other countries that have made agreements with the United States to denuclearize. Specifically, they point to Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And they say, look what happened to those countries that made agreements about nuclear weapons to the United States. They end up out of power and killed. And so I think my sense is that a simple statement may be a good beginning for the North Koreans, but really what they're looking for, at least historically, has been an end to the US-ROK alliance and the removal of all US military forces from the Korean Peninsula, which in the past has been completely unacceptable both for South Korea and for the United States.
In the past, it was completely unacceptable. Is it acceptable now?
I can't see how it could possibly be acceptable. The idea that we would remove all of our troops and the alliance and then North Korea would denuclearize out of its own goodwill is impossible to believe. There is zero trust on both sides. The denuclearization program, in all likelihood, is going to have to come first. And the verification process is going to be very intense, very problematic, and very difficult. I think the mode going forward is going to be distrust but verify. And how that works is really very unclear.
I think Abe's got a good point here, because the phasing of any deal between the U.S. and North Korea is going to be very important. What comes in what order? But I would caution against presuming that an outcome of the withdrawal of U.S. forces is somehow off the table. I think we have to, with President Trump, imagine that almost anything is possible. And while I would certainly counsel him not to withdraw our forces before denuclearization, I think for previous presidents, even the very idea of pulling U.S. forces off the peninsula as part of an arrangement with North Korea was really almost unthinkable. I think President Trump, I think almost anything is possible, so we need to buckle up.
What's at stake? I mean, we only have 2 months to go if everything goes well. But if the talks doesn't go well, what's at stake here?
Well, as Abe already referred, you know, when you have a summit meeting, a very high-level, high-risk arrangement between the two countries, if it fails, if it goes spectacularly south, then you could be in a very dangerous spot indeed, because there may not be many options left other than both ratcheting up the pressure again or even, as President Trump has repeatedly hinted, using force. So this is a high-risk gamble.
Abe, 2 South Korean presidents met with North Korean leader before, and they didn't produce significant results, but it didn't go dramatically bad. How can this time, how do you compare with the Inter-Korean summit and the meeting between U.S. and North Korea?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. Previous Inter-Korean summits have generated some goodwill, but no real lasting effects. That after the last one, just several months after the last Inter-Korean summit, North Korea conducted some attacks against South Korea. But this is very different. The American president meeting with the North Korean leader is very different than meeting between the leaders of North and South Korea. It conveys a great deal of legitimacy to the North Korean leader, and it suggests a great deal of attention from the United States. So I think it's very different. The other parallel I've been hearing is Nixon visiting Chairman Mao, which is also an imperfect analogy. But it does suggest that this is if this actually happens, if the meeting actually occurs, would be a very historic event.
Going forward, what should the Trump administration keep in mind as an important point factor dealing with North Korea?
Well, I would argue that they should keep in mind that the respect of the United States is one of the great prizes that North Korea hopes to earn through this summit process. It's not only about security assurances, but whether those assurances are credible. And that comes from the personal engagement of the U.S. president. Just before President Carter went to Pyongyang in 1994 to meet Kim Il-sung, he was briefed by the State Department, and he asked the State Department briefers, what do you think Kim Il-sung wants out of me? And I was one of those briefers. None of us had an answer. And so President Carter told us, he says, I think Kim Il-sung wants my respect, and I'm going to give it to him. I think the U.S. should keep in mind that the respect of a U.S. president is a thing of great value to Kim Jong-un, and so we should not sell that respect cheaply.
Abe.
Let me add a couple things. I completely agree with Frank that the respect is there. I think another piece I would add is that maintaining pressure is very important. My sense is that the economic pressure that Kim Jong-un is under is one of the reasons that North Korea has come to the table. And maintaining that pressure until we see real movement, I think is going to be important. Second that I would add is that Kim Jong-un is a very different leader than his father and his grandfather. He seems to have a different approach to nuclear weapons. He has a different style, and so we should not learn too much from history about North Korea's past behavior. We're sort of writing a new book at this point.
We'll end this conversation here and move on to our next segment. Senior South Korean envoys sat down with North Korea's reclusive leader, Kim Jong-un. Mr. Kim has had limited diplomatic experience, only meeting with officials from China, Cuba, and Syria since taking office 6 years ago. Now, Abe, this was the first time the world watched Kim Jong-un meeting with high-level delegation from the outside world. How was his performance?
It was very interesting to watch. He exuded confidence. He exuded some flexibility and openness. My sense was that he was very much playing to the cameras, especially playing to the South Korean people, showing that he's open, showing that he's somebody that can be worked with, and really trying to send a message to the South Korean people, South Korean government, that he wants to engage and that he's somebody that they can work with. Very different from his father, who people rarely heard his voice, people rarely talk to him. It's a very different style, and I think the message was confidence, calm, and openness.
Frank, what was your impression?
You know, this guy is not his father. He bears some resemblance to his grandfather physically and maybe also a little bit in his style, but he is decidedly modern, and he wants to project a decidedly modern image to the world. Now, Kim Jong-un imagines himself leading North Korea for another 30 years. So his time horizon is also very different from his father's. And I think that's shaping his negotiating behavior.
Abe, how do you expect Kim Jong-un's own character and style play into negotiations with the United States?
I think he has a flair for the dramatic, which also feeds into this summit that we have. The idea of him meeting with an American president is much more possible than imagining his father or meeting with an American president, because of that openness, because of that style. But we need to remember who he is. This is a man who killed his own brother. It's not just an avuncular, open, confident guy. He's also very brutal, very tough, and somebody that we should not take lightly.
South Korean delegation described Kim Jong-un as forthcoming and daring because they said he made clear positions on sensitive issues. Do you agree that he has been showing daring and forthcoming style so far?
He's definitely shown himself to be daring and willing to take risks. During this conversation, talking about his understanding that U.S. ROK military exercises had to continue is really pretty striking, a striking position for a North Korean leader. But also recall the other things that he's done in terms of accelerating nuclear tests, accelerating missile tests, incidents along the DMZ. Before he officially came to power, he's demonstrated that he's very proactive. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the conversation goes. But to me, the real question is what happens between now and May? What are the requirements that both sides need in order to really sit down and talk? And then what happens after that? Do both sides really go along with what they commit to, or do we slide back into confrontation the way we were before?
We'll end this conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, a time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a cartoon on the New York Times this week with the title, North Korea's Syria Connection. The New York Times says evidence has emerged that North Korea has been smuggling materials for the manufacture of chemical weapons to Syria, and that both countries are making efforts to circumvent sanctions. Frank, what's your reaction?
Well, you know, in the effort to assemble a long list of reasons for mistrusting North Korea and for potentially even resorting to the use of force against North Korea, the proliferation of WMD material is always near the top. And it's a good reminder that time may be on the U.S. side strategically, long run. The United States holds a lot of cards. But in the meantime, if North Korea continues bad behavior, they can do harm to us and to the international community. And the proliferation threat is one that ought to be high on the agenda of the summit meeting to curtail any risk of spread of WMD material off the peninsula.
To me, it shows the challenges that we face with enforcement. Because there's a second piece to this cartoon, the UN, with its border guards and looking in the wrong direction. That we've known about the proliferation threat from North Korea for a long time. We've tried to put pieces in place to do it, to contain the proliferation threat, but it's not working. And so the question is, if we really need to contain them, what are the other things that we need to do in order to really clamp down and prevent this threat?
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Frank, Abe, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jang Cho. Thank you for watching.